All right. Welcome, everyone. This is a new presentation on should we be regulating platforms, and if so, how? If you take a look at what's happened even in just the past couple of days, on Tuesday, Washington sued Amazon over price parity rules, arguing that they might be inflating prices. Just this week, Apple is also defending itself against antitrust charges for inflated prices in its stores. And last December, 46 states and the federal government sued Facebook for monopolistic practices. We're seeing regulation introduced in the UK, in the European Union, in China, and here in the United States. It's a really interesting question about whether or not antitrust for the industrial era is going to be suitable for the digital era and what that means. We have a remarkable set of speakers who have actually been involved in developing some of that legislation or commentary upon that legislation to give you a little bit of an overview for that today. This is brought to you by the Digital Business Institute at Boston University Questrom School of Business. We also run one of the largest platform research symposia. It takes place in July every year, and there's also the MIT Platform Summit for the executive version of that for the firms themselves. So one of the panelists quipped as we were organizing this, that I had actually brought in 4 progressives, 4 moderates, and 4 big tech operatives, which that isn't my taxonomy, but I'm hoping that that will make for a great conversation. We can't write legislation if one group is only talking for itself. So I'm really hoping that we'll have a terrific conversation. For those of you that are in the audience, I invite you to actually post questions through the Q&A, not the chat, but through the Q&A. These will be moderated, and you may be able to direct questions directly to individual speakers. We have a remarkable audience. We have over 600 people registered. We have people from the Federal Trade Commission. We have folks from the OECD. We have members of the staff from House and Senate Judiciary Committees. If you'd like to direct a question to a specific panelist, please do self-identify so we may be able to promote it and ask that question. Each speaker will be given about 5 to 8 minutes to present their case on how regulation should proceed. If there is time, then for a max of total of 10 minutes, then we'll take questions from other panelists and from the audience. So we can actually give you, hopefully a good overview of the progressive and the technology views of innovation as we move forward. This is recorded and be available, so everything that you say will be available in the future. And with that, we'd like to give you the very first speaker. Christina Kafara is a colorful character. I think she'll be a terrific introduction or start to some of the conversation. She's been working for more than 20 years on some of these cases and has key background in Google, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Samsung, Uber, and other cases that are live and ongoing. She's been giving expert advice to the European Commission and competition, Ireland, UK, United States, EU member states. She's a senior consultant with CRA in Europe, with a focus on antitrust, bundling, price discrimination, intellectual property rights, and even damage assessments. Okay, so you want to get going. Let's see you take it away.
Okay,
Christina.
well, thank you so much, Marshall. I completely like the definition of colorful. I will also confess to the panelists and the audience that the taxonomy that you mentioned originally emanates from me. It was me who kind of said, oh, there's 4 progressive, there's 4 operatives, and there's a few moderates. I will self-identify as a progressive, but I will not disclose who I attributed to the various categories. Let me start with what is necessary in this. You mentioned my background. Disclosure is important. So I think for people listening, I have done work adverse to Google in multiple circumstances, including for regulators. I've never worked for or against Facebook. I have done work for Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Uber, Netflix, and other players in the industry. So that out of the way, the question we're here to discuss is, at least as you put it, should we regulate and how? Well, I come from Europe, and the perspective I pose is certainly one that is perhaps very much influenced by the European position, but there is no question that in Europe we are. It's not if or when, it's happening right now. And of course, there is a big debate about how, but it is happening. And as to why, we have we share concerns that we also have in the United States about market power, exercise of that power vis-a-vis independent business and users. And so we think that there are at least in my view, three three things that regulation hopefully can help us achieve. The first one is we need to address what frankly is a fairly comprehensive failure of antitrust in this space. Now in Europe, we started with the best intention. This isn't about intention. It is certainly the case that 10 years ago, Europe was starting off and was a pioneer in this space, but the output at the level of Europe, in particular Brussels, has been quite miserable and disappointing. We had 3 major cases against Google, nothing to show for them. We just started in Europe an investigation on digital ad tech on the part of the European Commission, just when everyone else had been there, the UK, France, Germany, the Australians. Super late on Facebook, we hear that an investigation is just about to be opened formally. We took a long time to get to Amazon, a long time to get to Apple. Now, then you have the member states. Let's not forget, this is an important dynamic in Europe. You have the European Commission and the member states, France, Germany, and so on, have been particularly active. And they've tried to punch above their weight, but of course, there's only so much that they can do individually. So why is it that we failed so miserably? Well, there's a number of reasons. The inevitable fact that processes take too long, that remedies are too timid, ineffective. We just do behavioral in a very careful way. There's also the piecemeal nature of antitrust enforcement, which means you look at a very specific problem at a time. So if you think about what happened in Europe with Google, we were looking at shopping. You know, is shopping a great existential issue in the great big economy of search, where these shopping participants really worth the focus, and so on. So there is inevitably a piecemeal nature. There is inevitably also a certain timidity of regulators that we observe, and the fear of losing in court has been a great deal. So for all of these reasons, really, we have not achieved very much. The US, different case, has been in a permafrost for 20 years when it comes to antitrust enforcement, and I want to expand on that. And things are beginning to move, as you described. There have been important steps in the last few months, and so there is hope. But enforcement in terms of antitrust has not delivered so far. The second big theme that I think justifies thinking about regulation is the fact that we have not sufficiently and adequately thought about all of the problems that are associated with privacy, data protection in the context of an antitrust sort of enforcement institution. So in Europe, we have, of course, the GDPR. We've been progressing. We've been ahead of the game. We have had it for 3 years, but the reality is that it is enforced poorly because these national data protection agencies are under-resourced. But the main issue is really the fact that as antitrust practitioners, economists, and lawyers, there has been a failure to really integrate these two. The two operate still a bit as silos. There are some exceptions. There are movements. There is something happening in the UK. There has been something happening in Germany that suggests that privacy and antitrust really need to come together. But so far, we have not really been very good at tackling the market power that emanates from violations of privacy and data protection, and conversely, the market power that is built and preserved and entrenched by these violations. The third big theme, briefly, that I think needs to be in some way borne in mind in the regulatory discussion is that we have concern. There are concern about the pace and the direction of innovation in particular, because we're used to hearing, oh, these giants innovate like mad. But there are concerns, there are important voices, Darren Acemoglu, others have said, we have these ecosystems, and there will be discussion later in this panel about this ecosystem, the orchestration of ecosystem. Right? It's an expression I find a bit concerning, because there is significant evidence that we're not looking at creative disruption. This tech industry delivers systematically an appetizing dish that features the same set of ingredients: users, platforms, apps, startups. It's a combination of the two. This is the innovation we understand, and there's not very much else. So to conclude, and I'll just kind of go to the what we're doing. So what we're doing in Europe is coming up, and others in the panel will describe it further, with a plan which is fairly advanced. for how to regulate this, and it is both about the market power, the Digital Markets Act, and about the content moderation, the Digital Services Act, and both are being marched through Parliament at the moment. There is quite high-level discussion and quite sophisticated discussion about it. My observations, and we'll talk about it to conclude, is that these kind of plans are certainly deserving, and I want to see them succeed. There is not enough attention to business models in the way they are formulated, and so they are not sufficiently specific, and that will make it more difficult for them to be adequately self-enforcing, as they should be to some extent. There's nothing on mergers. There's nothing on data.
We have 3 more minutes for questions for other items in there. I don't know if the
I'll leave it here.
So I don't know if any of the panelists want to raise a hand and ask a question, but I can jump in with 2, and the audience is certainly invited. One interesting question on privacy versus regulation. There's evidence that GDPR, the General Data Privacy Regulation, actually retarded some innovation. And I would worry in some cases there might be interventions which actually prevent economic growth. Another is you wrote a wonderful piece summarizing elements of the Digital Markets Act, highlighting that mergers and antitrust had been omitted. And so I might ask you to comment on either of those 2 items. One, the extent to which we risk legislation that hurts and reduces innovation. And the other is, what about M&A? Or do you have solutions for that problem, given that it wasn't addressed?
So GDPR, I think this is, frankly, the talking points of the big platforms. They like to say GDPR is retarding innovation, right? It is just standing in the way. GDPR is a pretty effective, comprehensive approach to privacy. The problem is that it is not enforced. Why? Because the digital giants are putting every obstacle along the way, and the agencies are not sufficiently resourced. But as a framework, I think it is effective. I think it is not true that it is retarding innovation in any shape or form. It is pursuing the interest of citizens. That's great. That's what we're here for. Then on the mergers and acquisition, and generally the way in which the DMA leaves it out. I mean, it leaves it out because ostensibly there are limits about the sort of rules in the law under which it was formulated. And I'm not a lawyer and I won't expand on this here. But there's no question, and indeed today, the French, the German, and the Dutch the governments have come out with a big criticism of the DMA, saying precisely that it does not deal with M&A in a sufficient way. We cannot just focus on conduct. The way in which you need to address market power is ex ante, by effectively deterring and tackling mergers that will create that market power in the future that is difficult to deal with. So this is fundamental, and it is something that needs to be introduced in some way into the regulation. The UK does that. The UK has a different rule because, of course, they've gone off in their own world after Brexit. They have a digital regulation in which not only there is bespoke platform regulation, but there is a big significant piece, which is about mergers.
I need to jump to Ten Benkosi for this. I do think there's some interesting questions on mergers and acquisitions. I think Georgios Petropoulos is going to have some interesting writing on that forthcoming. So I'm hoping that will work. Well, thank you for that, Christina. Let me introduce our next speaker, Ten Benkosi Bonakele. This is the Commissioner for Competition of South Africa. I know you've got a wonderful background there. Appreciate that. Ten Benkosi has been looking at challenges in developing economies, regulating platforms, and how these are going to be managed in the future. He worked on cartels, construction bid rigging, telecommunications abuse of dominance. You're practicing attorney in Johannesburg and New York, which I thought was actually quite interesting. We also are very grateful to have you as a 2020 cohort of the Atlantic Fellows working on racial equity, advancing solutions for racial justice, both in the US and in South Africa. That's something that's really important, I think would be valuable for all of these platforms. You also have a degree from Fort Hare, where you occasionally teach, Pretoria and Nelson Mandela University. And for the audience, a really relevant piece of work is the book, Competition Law for the New Era. So you have a wonderful bit of expertise. Thank you. What are your thoughts on regulating platforms from the perspective of South Africa?
Thank you very much. Of course, platforms are a concern throughout the world in developing and developed countries. And I suppose you will hear about all the challenges in developed countries. I will try and not repeat these, but rather focus on some issues that we see from developing and emerging economies. So firstly, it is very clear that the challenge is enormous. You have the possibility of these markets being dominated far much quicker and easier than perhaps more matured markets. There is often less competitors with the kinds of resources that you would typically find in a developed economy. And the second issue is that the scales often don't balance between public regulators and the private sector, more particularly multinationals. And so you have emerging small regulators, young competition agencies, and they would typically not have the deep analytical expertise. And this is no criticism of these countries. It is a natural evolution that you're not going to create an agency in a country where you didn't previously have the law. The law is fairly recent. The education system has not produced these kinds of skills. And in fact, even the judiciary itself has not grappled with these questions. So you have that problem as well, that the regulation is somewhat behind these kinds of business models. It is complex to enforce antitrust in general, but more particularly when it comes to these types of markets. The third issue that is also quite important is the imbalance is also shown in resources, in financial resources that are required, but also in a very sort of interesting way. Sometimes the practical implementation of interventions, whether it is remedies or some enforcement commitments, are very difficult to enforce from a smaller jurisdiction. So the kinds of commitments, for example, the EU is able to extract from Google, very, very difficult when you go as a single, relatively small jurisdiction confronting you. So these are some of the things that we have seen. Mergers, I think you were discussing this with Christina, are particularly complex because often it is possible that a smaller jurisdiction may be ignored. It's not clear to me that the consequences of ignoring a small jurisdiction are big enough for some of these platforms. And so they can threaten not to operate from your country. We did see threats like these in Australia, actually. And Australia is not too small an economy, but you did see these kinds of threats. So I really think that the solution, of course, is about changing the regulations themselves and being far more targeted and specific about platforms. Platforms are a huge gateway to economic opportunity as well. Our countries are full of small and intermediate enterprises, and the platforms can in fact play a positive role in kind of opening up markets. But we know that the opposite is also true. So I think we need to design regulations that would allow broader participation, that would allow much more inclusivity in these economies deliberately. And the current antitrust laws are simply not designed to do that. Measures, I mean, I think, you know, I wouldn't go through everything that has been discussed, but the issue of the standards of analyzing measures, I absolutely agree with Christina. There are measures that we have approved, heartbroken, knowing that they are creating market power, they are creating problems, but the analytical instruments are just not sufficient enough.
So we had 2 minutes left for questions. Yes, you raised a couple of wonderful issues. One of them is the relative market power of the country relative to the platform, and also perhaps lacking the digital expertise to challenge them on their own home turf. Would it be possible to design legislation to have competitors keep an eye on one another? So perhaps they would have market power, they would also have expertise. So would it be possible, in your view, to design legislation to have the competitors balance and check one another and report to the authorities to get them to behave better?
For sure, and to some extent, I mean, you do have a little bit of that. I mean, we've had complaints that have been driven by other digital firms, and there is a possibility in South Africa, at least, that the competition authority could decline to prosecute, in which case then the other private participants would be able to pursue that prosecution. It's also possible in measures to intervene. Third parties, including competitors in South Africa, can intervene. Obviously, I mean, you have to treat that with some caution, but I think you are right. Where you have these gaps, it is possible that you can be able to mobilize interventions and resources from private participants. But I mean, I will say this, that what this demonstrates is also a huge gap at a global level on how to deal with these matters. And I'm hoping that we can talk about that as well, because I don't think that these are matters from a developing country point of view that could be sufficiently tackled at a national level.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. I got to say also, hats off, perfect timing. You're very well done on that. Thank you. We've had some great questions coming from the audience. I'm going to treat a few of these as forward passes to a few other categories. So one question, let me direct at Fiona. It's going to be speaking later. Does one-size-fits-all legislation fit all the different business models? I think she'll be speaking on some of those issues. Second question will forward pass to Jeffrey Parker. Could open banking as PSD2 be applied to data for digital platforms? And three, I'll forward pass this one to Jacques Clemet, who's coming speak in a bit. What's a bigger concern for Europe, US or China in regulation? So some wonderful questions there. So Tembi, thank you very much for your help on this. And I invite you to ask other questions of other panelists as things arise. With that, I'd like to introduce Michael Jacobides. Michael, we should all be grateful here. He's actually chairing a conference. He's taking time away to join us. So to give you an indication of how important this is. He is, a Sir Chair at London Business School. He's also written extensively on a number of these areas. Recent works include works on theories of ecosystems. He's also provided Senate testimony written for the United States. He's also been doing these several times. He's also been writing for the Hellenistic Commission in Greece and for the European Union and UK. So he's been providing a lot of influential work on theories of ecosystems and how it is that innovation matters in these ecosystems. So with that, Michael, please take it away.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be with you. Given that I would like to cover a lot of space in a limited time, I will have my clutch, which is my little aid, the visual aid. And like Christina disclosures, I'm an academic and I'm really interested in many of these dynamics, but I've also have a quasi regulatory hat as I occasionally dabble there, and I have advised companies directly or indirectly through Evolution Limited, BCG, and others, and big tech in actually now both US, Europe, and Asia over the last 12 months. I just get engaged in the things that I think are interesting. Let me just move into, first of all, what are we speaking about? Because I think that there is considerable confusion. I remember speaking in a conference that the OECD had about ecosystems, and I think that we are speaking about two very different things, and I think we should have a bit of clarity in terms of what it means. The challenge with ecosystems and platforms are the things on which ecosystems sit. And it is the ecosystems that we care about, not just the underlying technology that provides only part of the incentives, but not necessarily the full picture, have two different dimensions, complementary but entirely distinct. One of them is the multi-product ecosystem, something that means that you can bundle a number of things together and you can give them to the consumer, and we can say, now, don't you bother your little brain with anything complex. We're going to have everything sorted for you. And sadly, consumers are very lazy, so they'll do that very happily. The second thing is what us who worked in the theory of the firm originally said, ecosystem, that's a new way of organizing. Hence some of the academic work that was referenced a moment ago. In that sense, a multi-actor ecosystem, distinct from a multi-product ecosystem, is something that has not someone who is a buyer with a supply chain, not someone who vertically integrates having their own employees, but an orchestrator who uses complementers to give something to the consumer. Now, both of these coexist, and they're causally related, because the broader your little bundle is that you give to the customers, also the more you will need to engage other people. So if you look at what big tech is doing, they are increasing the scope of their multi-market ecosystem, and they are increasing the extent to which they use multi-actor ecosystem, where they're like, hey, I'm the boss, I'm going to tell you what the rules are, how we're going to be organized, and there is a very specific way in which these things are structured. It's the architecture of the ecosystem, and this stuff matters. So this is the first distinction, and so that we know what we're talking about, because it'll raise slightly different topics. And just to go to Asia, for instance, where these super apps started, thinking about Tencent and Alibaba, the idea, and that's when Financial then went out to get its first serious chunk of cash, said, we really want to envelop the customer and ensure that we circle them, and that they are dependent on us. Which is interesting, but of course we're going to do that. We're going to do that. Hang on, that is, my computer now has a mind of its own. We're going to do that with a mind of its own. What nearly was in your picture was the number of acquisitions that you saw and Financial have. And it's interesting because now we see this emergence of these new types of ecosystems that are growing, and of firms that are delivering on this very elusive thing that conglomerates of yesteryear were trying to do. Think that in the same week that Time Warner shed part of its huge expansion, thinking, no, it doesn't pay to really be broad, Amazon bought MGM for $8.5 billion. Why? Because they want to increase the stronghold on video in order to be able to give a package that's going to be competitive to the customers. Now, what does that mean? I think that it really means something serious when it comes to the way that we think about antitrust. And this is an unabashed plug, but also a summary, because I don't have to go into the details of some of the work that I've done with the chairman of the Hellenic Competition Commission, Yannis Lianos, where we were like, well, rather than thinking about the market failures, we may want to think about the ecosystem failures, because these are failures in specific ways in which these structures can exist. I know that Christina and Fiona call it business models. We in the academic literature might use slightly different wording. I think that we kind of mean the same thing. We mean that we need to understand what are these conditions, what are these structures that exist in the ecosystems, and that we need to start looking at these things in a more systematic way. There's some of the Evolution Limited white papers that also explain that in the context of the DMA, DSA. That also suggests that we need to start articulating the issues, which I think are manifold, that may be creating the problem to begin with. Think about what's happening in terms of gatekeepers, one of my more recent pet peeves. If you think about, or rather before going to the gatekeepers, running ahead of myself, if you go back a step in the underlying theory, if you look at the way that thinking has progressed in regulation, and I'll confess that I'm a recent comer there. I came from strategy, was interested in these dynamics. And then because I did not want my soul to burn in hell, only advising companies, because I realized that anti-competitive power was quite important, I guess I'm a more recent joiner to part of the antitrust debate. But if you look at the way that thinking has evolved, it has looked at new phenomena, and we found new ways of characterizing the problem. So with the corporate case, we started thinking about aftermarkets. With the credit cards cases, we started looking at these multi-sided platforms that exist and understand the effects. And I think that what is happening here is that we see with these digital ecosystems, we start identifying some canonical problems. And these are the problems of, hey, this is the way in which the structure of the ecosystem leads for significant pressures, like the ones we see, for instance, in the Internet of Things area. How is it, for instance, that these devices are going to be interconnected? Or things that may sound very simple and easy that you nearly saw a moment ago that have to do with the types of levels of control. Things like the operating system, 14.5 in Apple, hugely important because it changes the dynamics in advertising. Google is saying, oh, I'm going to have a lovely little privacy sandbox, but I'm going to be really calling the shots and saying who's going to be allowed to play and who not.
Michael, let me interject. We've got a minute left.
Okay.
So you wrap your key ideas. You also had a really cool definition of market power that you might want to pass and mention before we move on.
So let me just, I want to finish just on this, if I may, and perhaps we'll go into the conversation. This is the idea that the gatekeepers, which have been looked at in numerical terms, oh, they need to be more 65 billion or number of users and the rest of it, should be done qualitatively. So we should be saying there are some of these orchestrators that are extremely powerful. When they have exclusive consumer access, consumer lock-in, there's limited seller bargaining power, there's a required seller multi-home and barriers to entry. And you can think about the examples from your phones, because you're like, well, if I have a phone, people are going to have one phone and as such one operating system. And if they want to go to a dating website, they'll probably use that operating system, which means that if you work with them, anything that you do, you will need to sync to their tune. Whereas on the other hand, if you think about the orchestrator in the transport area, well, you're not going to have the same problem because it's very easy for you to switch. So not all orchestrators are the same, not all ecosystems are the same. And I think that we are in the beginning of understanding what we need to do. But by God, they're very powerful. And I think that we are now starting to develop the vocabulary to be able to articulate A, the nature of the problems, hence my preference speaking about some of these ecosystem problems, and B, structural attributes that we think are things that are rising to the problem. And let me stop.
Michael, I'm going to invite you to share your slides with the audience. I think it'd be a wonderful addition. I think it also has a wonderful set of references in there that you should probably share. So let me invite you to share that, and also like your definition of market power, which I thought would be interesting and also worth sharing with this group. Thank you with that. At this point, let me introduce Carmelo Senamo, who's also, I believe, one of Michael Jacobidi's co-authors on this. Carmelo is a professor of strategy and entrepreneurship and co-director of the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Center at University of Copenhagen. Frequently publishes in top academic journals, Strategic Management Journal, Org Science, Research Policy. Also a practitioner, he does a lot of interesting work with the practice itself and getting organizations off the ground. He's got several Best Papers Awards, been focusing on mobile, gaming, automotive, and recently co-authored Towards a Theory of Ecosystems with Michael Jacobides. Well cited, hopefully this would add another interesting set of issues. And then also maybe you can even comment on some of the chat that's been going on about GDPR and whether or not that's created or destroyed value. So with that, Carmelo, please take it away.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I mean, it's a great pleasure being part here, and haven't been anticipated by Michael. Basically, half of my minutes are gone, right? They've been already covered by interesting things by Michael. So, but I want basically to just follow on what has been said so far, right? So that the focus should be really on how, right? That's basically where the debate is. I don't think that the debate today is on whether But the how question, I mean, is very difficult to tackle here, because the focus could be on different things. Now, the focus has been on something which I believe is fundamentally wrong. I mean, size of network is size of data, and the remedies that have been put forth are just the one sort of one-fits-all remedies, such as limiting the ability to aggregate data, limiting the ability to expand the platform in terms of functionality, without distinguishing between the different types of platforms. And as Michael said, I mean, what is more fundamental, which will be what I would focus on, is really the architecture. So who controls what, right? So those are where I believe the problems start. And then again, so what Michael was speaking about is essentially the same mechanisms that create value that can also lock in users. Two things: default options and interfaces. So that's basically the strategic mechanism, right? Coordination mechanism that the platforms use. It is not, that's what we have to look at. It's not the size of the network per se that makes network effects stronger or weaken or enforcing, but it's how the interactions are shaped and how the interactions are reinforced within a particular platforms among the multiple actors that get there. So I think that if we just focus on size and we have this one-fits-all solutions, we're really trading one problem, which is the potential market failures or coming from monopolization, for another problem, which is the inability to actually enable some of the small firms to innovate in the ecosystem. And essentially because those interfaces are needed, that some of those default options are ways to coordinate the users towards one particular consumption options. Now the problem starts also there, with this curation. So of course, when you direct towards the default options, well, you essentially you are getting rid of some of the bias, but you are in other sense also creating some potential other bias. So the question is really, what are these interfaces used for, right? So what is this coordination mechanism are basically directed. So Andre has a wonderful paper published a few years ago on the reason why some platforms may want to divert search away from the convergency of the market, and that's fundamentally because you want to enable others to discover unknown sellers, right? And guess what? I mean, this increases also the revenue of the platform. So the platform gets richer by this, but it also increases basically the diversity of the people on the platforms. That's also one aspect, one thing that we find in a more innovative platforms where the platform uses selective promotion. So it decided to select some particular projects to enable basically customers to discover them. And this has some positive spillovers in terms of innovation for other products that are similarly innovative, right? And guess what? Again, revenues goes up for the platform, but that's consequential. It also goes up, for the other developers there. So you reduce concentration within the platforms among this. Now, default options can also be used, of course, to favor the platform's own strategy, right, at the detriment of a large part of its users. And I think that Apple's with the default that is now introduced in terms of privacy, essentially, right, I mean, it's a new feature that, of course, it strengthens the business model of Apple vis-a-vis Android, right? So it creates, if you want, a more differentiation in terms of competition, but it also affects negatively developers that rely on ads-based model within the platform, right? So it's redefined the rules. So it's part of the interface to now dictate where value is and where it should be. And another aspect that I want to bring in is physical versus digital, or physical and digital. So Michael was speaking about the multi-product. We're not paying too much attention to this, but physical products such as the iPhone, iWatch, and all this lineup, or Amazon Alexa, right? They can become potent interfaces to, again, direct and users to default towards one ecosystem versus another. So those compatible, with those products. So if you are an iPhone user and then you get into, an iWatch, you are defaulting already on apps that are, produced for that, and you don't even think, right, of the alternative ecosystem. So essentially, you create what is referred as this competitive bottlenecks, right? So they compete the ecosystem, sure, but for the users that are already in the ecosystem, there isn't really alternative, right? So, and you can build whatever interoperability, standardization across this, you still have this competitive bottlenecks. So they can really be strong ways to control where the boundaries are, and build basically switching cost for consumers. Now, to what extent these are pro-innovative, pro-competitive? We still don't know, frankly speaking, right? So is the privacy issue bringing, the Apple is bringing in, will allow to, more competition, more contestability between, the system, or will, in fact, just favor Apple's, business model and make Apple's richer by getting out, the app developers that are building, free stuff that are not desired by Apple and does not fit into Apple's business model, and just have those that are moving into subscription-based models. So that's, I think, the open question, and that's why we should perhaps the focus should be on these interfaces, what they do when they create value for whom. Thank you. I'll stop there.
We have 2 minutes left for questions. So Carmela, you've written elsewhere fairly eloquently against the bans on data aggregation. So for example, Germany says you can't combine, Facebook can't combine the data for WhatsApp and Facebook. If you don't want to ban data aggregation, how would you address the data hegemony problem? Or is there a privacy issue? Or is it not a problem? So how would you address that?
Well, so again, the problem is, how you use data. So I think that, one aspect is, do we believe that data, builds, barriers to entry, and for whom? So that's the first question. And I think that, again, you have to go to the interfaces. So if we look, some of the companies, right? Particularly in the social space, we have a lot of multi-homing, right, by users. So yes, you might be locked into, your Facebook friends, whatever, but it's fairly easy to rebuild that if you go to Twitter, if you go to, other social networks. Also because, as a user, you might be interested in other features, right? So the value that has in terms of, the data aggregation in terms of locking in users is fairly limited in that case. It might not be the case again if you have, interfaces like, the phones and the things where you have all of your other data. In that case, you suggested, right, a solution, which I'm borrowing actually, right, which I don't believe in on the portability or, interoperability, for a simple reason, because most of the value that gets created through the aggregation will be lost because it's contextual to the type of interaction that you have. So, as you suggested, it would be better actually to have this in situ access where, you have yet another way to get access to the data.
Well, thank you for that. I think Jeff will be speaking on exactly that issue just in a bit. Also, excellent on timing. Thank you for that. The mention of interfaces and of interoperability is also a perfect segue to our next speaker, who will be addressing exactly some of those issues. I'd like to call in Fiona Scott Morton, who is a Theodore Nierenberg Professor of Economics at the Yale School of Management, with courtesy appointments in the law.
Don't even list them all. The university likes to do that.
Well, you are influential, Fiona. Well done in there. You've done. I couldn't believe you have publications not only in AER, Journal of Economic Policy, RAND, Yale Law Journal, and even New England Journal of Medicine. So you've done quite some influential work in here. If we're going to be quick about it, one thing I should absolutely mention is that this wonderful set of roadmaps for the antitrust cases against Google and Facebook that I encourage our audience to read. And also the University of Chicago Stiegler reports on the study of digital platforms is being used by the Senate Judiciary Committee. So wonderful set of documents as starting points for the design of legislation. So please tell us more about the interoperability and the interfaces.
Yeah, I think rather than give the high level approach, I think of the speakers thus far, I'm going to just dive in and say that one really important tool that regulators have at their disposal is to mandate or encourage, as appropriate, interoperability. Interoperability is super common in the modern economy. Think about cases with direct network effects like mobile phones, fixed line phones, SMS texting, email. These are all cases where there's a common interface that's available and public, and anybody can connect to it who satisfies the technical requirements. We have cases with indirect network effects that are like this also. Think about electric plugs and electric appliances. The plugs are the same in all the different houses in America, and as a result, An appliance can be plugged into any one of them, and there can be any number of competitors on the appliance side. You don't have to generate electricity and distribute it and make the mixer or the washing machine. Think about DVDs and DVD players. Again, the more adopters of DVD players, the more DVDs were available. It's an old example, but I'm sure many people on the call remember them. So what's important about all those examples? The network effects accrue at the level of the market, not at the level of the company. So it is not the case that one ISP email provider cares about the network effects within its ISP. It's connecting everybody to the internet, and the network effect is how many people can you email on the internet. That's everybody, not the people inside your corporation. Okay, contrast that with, say, Apple's store, where there are more apps on the store and more people buy an Apple handset, but the network effects work inside Apple. Or Facebook social network, where they're direct network effects and they're proprietary to the Facebook platform. More users of Facebook doesn't make Snapchat or Twitter more valuable. Now let's think about how that impacts entry and competition. If I want to set up an ISP, I can enter as a tiny ISP with 10 customers, and my 10 customers have enormous network effects. They can email anyone in the world that has an email address. Users can switch ISPs if they don't like my service or my price. Okay, that's not true if I'm an entering social network. If I'm an entering social network with 10 users, my users can email, can message each other, talk to each other. They don't have access to the whole world. Now, the regulator, therefore, can use interoperability and make it into this very powerful tool, because it can defeat the entry barrier, which is the network effects. If a platform is required to be interoperable, that opens access to the platform, that lowers entry barriers, and then suddenly you have more competition. It's also quite a low cost, light touch way to regulate, because the regulator can set up a technical committee of entrants and industry participants and consumer groups and the dominant firm and figure out what the interface is. And the oversight is going to be necessary to prevent capture by the dominant firm. The regulator is going to have to stay on top of things, but the regulator doesn't have to be writing the rules and doing detailed price setting or anything like that. In the DMA, there actually is quite a bit of interoperability in Article 6.1 in a few different places, but it's not a general principle, which I think it should be. And I think in the United States, we could use this well also. We have actually, Senator Blumenthal, my senator, has sponsored an act called the Access Act a couple of years ago that started down this path, and I like that a lot. Of course, if you're going to do interoperability, you also have to have a non-discrimination component. I can't have an interface that some people can use and others can't, or that's designed to favor one business model over another. Now, innovation is something we're going to hear from shortly by the people who say, don't regulate, because if you regulate, you'll destroy all innovation, then we'll be driving horse and buggy before you know it. I think that's an overstatement. So for example, we can think about regulation increasing innovation in several ways. One, if the platform actually has to work to keep its customers because there's competition, then they have more incentive to innovate, okay, obviously. And by the way, just because a platform is spending X billion dollars on innovation today doesn't mean that that's the relevant counterfactual, right? We want to know how much would they be spending if they faced real competition. Also, if there's competition, that lessens the incentive of the platform to invest in what I'll call exploitation. So algorithms that figure out who's vulnerable when, algorithms that work out who the gambling addicts are and show them gambling ads, algorithms that take advantage of behavioral biases. And if we think about the fairness component of the DMA, that also is likely to raise the share of the pie that the complementary business users get, and that's going to give them an incentive to innovate. So there are several reasons why we might expect innovation to go up with good regulation. Furthermore, I just, on the last point, want to put together innovation and interoperability. Once you've got a standardized electric plug, innovators can work on number and variety of appliances. We have just no limit on what can be done on that side of the market because they all face a reliable market and a way to connect to that market that's non-discriminatory and open.
That's great.
I remember when I was young, AT&T was required to make their network interoperable, and suddenly we had innovation in phones. I remember instead of a heavy black phone, I had some cute pink phone or something. Okay, and lastly, Facebook. If you make Facebook's network interoperable, then new social networks can enter, send and receive posts, and there might be innovation in content moderation and in the user interface and so forth. So that's it. And lastly, Marshall, I'll just say, you asked me one size fits all. I think general principles fit all. I'm in favor of laws that say there should be more competition and fairness and non-discrimination. But the exact solution, the optimal regulation, is likely to depend on specific facts. And there, I think the UK has shown us a very nice model of how to do that.
Wonderful. Well, let me follow up with one additional question specific to interoperability. A good example of that, one might hope, would be PSD2, or Payment Services Directive 2, coming out of Europe. There was some evidence that in order to thwart interoperability, individual banks chose what we would call non-standard standards, making it harder to actually connect. How would you solve that kind of problem?
Well, that's what the regulation does. I mean, the regulator empowers a technical committee. There's a standard set, and everybody who wants to interconnect has to adhere to that standard. And then, of course, as with all laws, there has to be some enforcement mechanism.
Okay, so it'd be interesting. I know in the UK, 7 banks got together, and since there were only 7, they managed to solve that issue themselves, which I thought was quite interesting.
I think the government helped them a little bit.
They did nudge them along on that case, so I thought that was helpful. You also wrote with Christina what I thought was a good critique of a listing of the issues in the Digital Markets Act. And one of the things that came out of that, of course, was this question about missing elements of mergers and antitrust. Did you have solutions for that? Since you'd highlighted that as something that was missing, what might you do about that?
Yes, this is my non-academic piece where I use the very technical term business models. I'll point out that economists are academics also, not just the strategists. Let me just say that I think Vestager has solved that one already. She's just basically told the National Competition Authority to send her the cases. I think to get jurisdiction, the European Commission has to have mergers that are big, which doesn't catch the potential and nascent competition that we care about. But if you have the National Competition Authorities able to notice, or whatever the technical term is, the mergers to the European Commission, then I think you can solve that.
Splendid. Okay, wonderful. Well, that's even a few seconds early. So quite a marvelous amount of material that you've covered on that. Also been really instrumental in helping to design some of that legislation, both in Europe and in the United States. So with that, thank you very much. So let me introduce Susan Athey as our next speaker. Susan is an economics of technology professor at Stanford, director also of the Social Impact Lab. Susan has been a professor at Harvard and at MIT, focusing on economics of the internet, new media platforms, econometrics, and machine learning. Susan has joint degrees undergraduate in math, computer science, and economics, quite extraordinary, and even focusing recently on math-based currencies, over 18,000 Google Scholar sites, former chief economist at Microsoft, first woman to win the John Bates Clark Medal for economists under 40 with influence, John von Neumann Prize, Jean-Jacques Lafont Prize, and honorary degree from Duke. One thing I might mention for fun, you started teaching micro at MIT the term after I had been through the class. So I missed you as an instructor. So I appreciate that, but I'm following the work since that time. So I'll have to find another opportunity to take one of those classes. But Susan, take it away. What are your thoughts on platform regulation?
Thanks. And thanks so much for having me here. I do want to mention I was consulting chief economist for Microsoft for many years. They hired another full-time chief economist in 2014, and now they're on their second one after that. So although many people remember me for doing that, it's been many years since I've had more than an arm's length relationship with them. And just more on my perspective, in addition to academic work here, I am on the boards of 5 technology firms, all, some grew from small to large and some were large when I came on, and I advise venture capitalists as well. And so just one immediate comment on the innovation. Innovation often comes from platform participants. And, once a platform gets big, it's much easier and safer for it to use its assets to thwart competition than it is to innovate and compete directly on the merits. It makes sense. While a lot of the new innovation comes from platform participants. And so really making sure that the that there's competition to enable the innovation that is most likely to matter in the future is a really important theme. So I have a few comments here. I agree that it is important to understand the categories of platforms and specifically to understand the tactics that can be used to enter. So we need to understand what would you need to do to enter, put yourself in the shoes of an entrant, and also think about what an incumbent can do. What are the easy tactics you can do to prevent people from getting a toehold? And scale economies are a huge part of thinking about that, because in almost all platforms, the indirect network effects and scale economies are important. And so dominant firms are going to be focused on trying to prevent entrants from solving the chicken egg problem. And they're going to try to soften competition by making switching and multi-homing hard. So that's going to be, how they do that and what's the most effective tactic is going to differ, but that's the common theme of what incumbents want to do. And that's where we should be looking for incumbent behavior that differs from social welfare. Dominant firms will also tend to vertically integrate or use long-term exclusive contracts if they see a scenario where either buyers or suppliers, different sides of the market could get powerful, either directly by getting big enough to matter, or indirectly by somebody aggregating a set of buyers or suppliers and making multi-homing or switching easier. So those are big themes that you see when you dive into the case studies of each categories. And in those environments, we want to think that some types of software or middleware tools can be really important for facilitating competition, overcoming barriers to entry. And this goes back to the big platform case of the 90s. In the Microsoft case, browsers were viewed as middleware that helped reduce switching costs. Actually, Mac wasn't in the market for the antitrust case, but if you look at what happened afterwards, people spending time in the browser reduced the switching costs between PC and Mac because you were spending so much of your time in the browser. It also facilitated the entry of something like Chromebooks by solving the chicken and egg problem on developers, since people were accessing apps through the browser. So you could come without a lot of apps and enter. So we need to be really cognizant of what types of tools and middleware or other types of products that facilitate switching and multi-homing. And so that's something actually Fiona and I have worked on together. Like many, I'm grateful for all of Fiona's leadership here. One of the things we've talked about is something that we call platform annexation. And platform annexation is a particular type of tactic that works in some types of markets, like ad tech. And platform annexation is basically when a platform either merges or creates long-term contracts with tools and services that market participants would use, and tools and services if they were separately owned, would serve their customers and help their customers multi-home, and thus make sure that network effects accrue at the market level rather than the platform level. But when there's vertical integration into those tools are instead used to create barriers to entry and to prevent customers from multi-homing to entering platforms. And so we talk about how, it's a category that has been considered, like, qualitatively, the economics are similar to the literature, but the specific tactics are just incredibly effective in some markets. And so we think that they deserve special attention. A final comment I want to make is that we do have to think about who is it that actually could really threaten some of these entrenched platforms. If we think about things like search, where Microsoft lost something like $16 billion, don't quote me on the exact number, on the path to profitability, or like entry in mobile phones, which would be really hard. In the end, who's going to enter? It probably will be a big firm who has the ability, the resources to lose the money on the way, and also might have some complementary assets that make it more strategically valuable for them to take those risks and lose that money, and also might be able to coordinate participants and be credible as an entrant. So regulation that just gets down on big firms, I think, can be really counterproductive. Like Amazon's big, but they have a tablet that could possibly grow into a threat to mobile phones if the right conditions were satisfied. And, I don't think we should worry if, Amazon pushes Amazon products or Prime Video or Alexa through a tablet while they're on the path to growing and just finding just some way that somebody could possibly enter. So its conduct can be very different when done by an established or entrenched firm that's trying to deter entry versus be the way in for a big firm. So I think we just do need to remember that we should think about incentives and conduct and impact rather than just preventing big firms from being potentially the only hope for competition in some of these entrenched markets.
Oh, wonderful, thanks. Let me pull in a couple of audience questions. You seem to have sparked a little bit of dialogue in the background. It's kind of fun. So let me give you two. One of these is, what are your thoughts on providing incentives to content creators as a way to stimulate innovation? Have you thought of ways to do that? A second is, in the context of platform development, as you bundle in these extra features, are there occasions when that could be pro-consumer welfare, as in the case of getting supply economies of scale or demand economies of scale? So here are two follow-on questions for you.
Well, so I mean, one kind of content that's super important is news, and I've done a lot of research on that. And you know, some things are just that the way that technology has changed, it's very hard for something that has so many public goods like news to really be profitable. And so subsidization of those industries or finding different ways to compensate them has broader societal value. But we also need to be cognizant of the fact that in general, one thing platforms can do when the developers or the content creators are small and sort of don't have much power, what an intermediary wants to do is keep all the participants kind of small so that their search benefits are high and so that none of them get any bargaining power. And so we need to be cognizant of the situation where like small creators really have very little power, and the platform really serves as a gatekeeper over the consumers they're trying to reach. So even platforms, frankly, I see them sometimes being so negative towards their developers that it's actually not even profit maximizing for them. Like if I was just advising to maximize profits, I would say, hey, like if you really crush your developers or your content creators too much, it's not in the long-term interest of your platform. So sometimes middle managers trying to maximize profits don't do what's in the long-term interest of the firm. But I think that more broadly, this can be, when the discussion about gatekeepers really needs to take into account the scenario where in some cases, like in gaming consoles, their big developers do have a lot of bargaining power and in fact can extract a fair bit of surplus because those developers are making these hit games that are so important, they can bring consumers with them from platform to platform. While in other scenarios like small apps on a phone or things like that, the developers really aren't able to move consumers with them. I've also written about that in terms of Apple Pay, and even credit cards companies weren't big enough to have power over Apple. In terms of, yeah, go ahead.
Let me interject because I'm going to have to bring Jacques into the conversation for that. So I think the payment system is a really interesting issue, especially even as Apple's getting sued on those very issues this week. So it's an interesting, wonderful problem. Thank you for that. Some great issues on the innovation element of bringing in the user. So thank you for that. And we'll ask to see if we can get some of your works distributed to the audience after this is over. With that, I'd like to bring in Jacques Crémet. It's also especially nice to have him joining us today because he's also helping to run a conference in France at this time on economics for the common good for Jean Tirol's Nobel Prize winning work. Some wonderful work. He's a professor of economics at Toulouse School of Economics, focused on industrial organization, political economy, internet. He's been prior faculty at Virginia Polytech and Wharton at University of Pennsylvania. I have to say it's kind of fun. I cite Jacques' work in my own PhD thesis. So it's been around a while. He's been doing some important work on information and information economics for quite some time. Jacques is also the co-author of the precursor to the EU Digital Markets Act on competition policy for the digital era. So he's really got the expertise on how these things are set up. So with that, Jacques, please tell us more about what the regulation should be. And I think we had a couple questions from the audience that they're looking forward to take for you. Thank you.
So Marshall, first you said an old, so that was one good reason of leaving. There was the first one earlier when Christina,
established, my friend, established.
when I heard Christina's classification, I'm pretty sure she classified me as moderate. And I think she's a bit like God. In the Revelation, God says, "You are lukewarm, you are not hot, you are not cold, hence I vomit you." So I thought this was really mean, but I'll still go on. Lots of what I planned to say has been said already, so I'll try to go over it, but go shorter on the things which have been said and a bit discuss some of the issues that have been raised. So 3 years ago, I didn't really know anything about competition policy. I was asked to join this group, which wrote a report for the European Commission. And it was somewhat interesting because we discussed, between us, should we write about regulation? We said, we've been asked to write about the competition policy. Let's focus on competition policy. And we made a few proposals, which I still believe would be important and good reforms of competition policy. To mention two of them, but there are a number of them: reversal of burden of proof for some type of cases, new responsibility for marketplaces, and so on. As I said, I still believe that those reforms would be good, but we run into two problems. First, it's very, very hard and very difficult to change competition law. I learned a lot from Fiona on this, but competition law is a big ship which is driven by the case law, and you can't change it. I mean, it's absolutely incredible that in the Epic versus Apple case, one of the important precedents was the Aspen ski slopes. I mean, you think, no, how come what was said, in that case is relevant for Epic Apple? You just can't believe it. Then the second thing is that there are lots of problems which I really don't think that even a totally revamped competition law could solve. For instance, Susan and Fiona have been speaking about interoperability. So we all agree, I think that nobody would disagree that refusing interoperability for no good reason is anti-competitive. The problem is, how do you go about proving it? What is the right amount of interoperability? It's an incredibly difficult issue. And it's an incredibly difficult issue if you're going to tackle it 5 years after the facts, trying to go through emails, understanding why somebody chose this or that technical made that technical choice. So I think for all those reasons, people felt that we should add a little bit of, at least a little bit of regulation to the stew on top of competition law. And the problem is, what type of regulation? So there are two, about 1,000 variations. So first there's a DMA, and let me caricature it, basically the DMA, you draw a list of the cases you were not able to solve by competition law, and you said, I would have liked to impose this and this on the firm, and right now it's forbidden. Okay, so I don't have to go through a trial, I don't have to prove anything. Now, okay, I criticize it. On the other hand, I think it's a good start. I think it could be good depending on the way it's applied. Lots of the criticisms have to do with unintended consequences, but it applies to a very small set of large firms. And we can say lots of nasty things about Google or Amazon and so on, but they're phenomenally innovative firms. It's not, before you stop them innovating, it will be very, very hard. So I think that, I agree with Fiona, but innovation, you've got to be, you can't just say because there's regulation, there's not going to be innovation. That's not deep enough. Then the other solution, which people mention, which is the British solution, the Digital Markets Unit, where you basically tell a group of people, you go and discuss in depth with the different gatekeepers. I'm not sure I like the term, but let's use it. And you understand their business model, and then you make a bespoke regulation for that gatekeeper. It's clear, for instance, that if you think of interoperability, this would be presumably, if you trust the regulator, that's a better solution because the regulator can do a very, very fine job on this. Now, the problem, of course, it gives huge amount of power to the regulator, and we don't have a good theory of regulation, and we need to think through exactly what does it mean. Okay, and so I think there's really lots of very interesting issues. We are hampered in great part by the fact that we don't understand. We understand not very well the economics of a digital world. We've lost totally any economics of the regulatory process. So that's a big problem. And I know that speaking to there are lots of American friends here, and we're really looking forward to see what you're going to be doing.
So let me follow up with one question that came from the audience earlier, which I thought was a fun and playful question. So what is Europe more afraid of, platforms from the US or from China, and why?
Well, platforms from China are not active in Europe, so no, we are not very worried about them. Am I more afraid of American imperialism or Chinese imperialism? That's a different issue. But, I think, but right now, in terms of platforms, I mean, it's clear that Chinese platforms are not really very operative, apart from TikTok, but I'm not sure that's a big threat.
But would you have any thoughts on jurisdictional issues, such as how things should apply? To give you an example of that, imagine that, what would you think of the extension of the laws of one country to another? Suppose, for example, you took free speech from the United States versus free speech from China, as might be implemented on platforms received by the citizens of any particular country. Any thoughts on that?
Well, first, I would say free speech from the US and speech from China. I would drop the free in that case. Look, I think on those issues, on the issues of speech, and there's a very interesting article in the FT this morning by the head of some firm whose name I've forgotten, but who does encrypted messaging, okay, who says, look, I can't decide what's the right level of encryption, okay? Governments should tell me. And there's some issues on which governments want, politicians want to blame firms and not take the responsibility. Okay, I mean, we do the same thing as economists sometimes, okay? So, and I think that, this question of free speech is really a question which is, just, you need government regulation. It's not, I don't want, I've got people I like who work for Facebook. They shouldn't be the one deciding what I'm allowed to say and not say, or what Trump is allowed to say or not say.
I look forward to many longer conversations on that topic. I think there's some really interesting things on free speech and disinformation that I think really need to be addressed. And I agree with you. This is going to take some work. This is going to take some work. Let me thank you so much for that. It was great to have your perspective, especially given your input and all the legislation that's taking place. With that, I'd like to bring in Jeffrey Parker, who is a professor of engineering at Dartmouth and director of the engineering management program there. Jeff's been studying platforms for more than 20 years. He worked in engineering and finance at GE, so he's been both on the industrial side and on the kind of the economics and platform side. He co-chairs MIT and BU platform summits. He's co-authored one of the leading books, sold more than 250,000 copies in 10 different languages. He's also co-recipient of the Thinkers 50 Best Digital Thinking Award, being recognized globally for having interesting ideas on platforms. And he's got one article, it's an all-time top 50 from Harvard Business Review, so he's been kind of a busy guy. And he's done some recent work on platforms, mergers, and antitrust, and was one of those helping to review the economics of the Digital Markets Act for the European Union. Jeff's also a long-term buddy and co-author, and if you ever get a chance to get out on his boat, take it. It's a lot of fun. So with that, Jeff, take it away.
Thank you, Marshall, and just great to be here with so many friends and colleagues. And I think I'll echo Jacques. When you say over 20 years, then that means we've been around a while. And I actually did get to overlap with Susan. I audited your contracts course when you taught it with Bengt. So that was tremendous fun, and have really enjoyed seeing what you've done over the years. So I want to dovetail a bit. Fiona's points about interoperability are really well taken, and I'll touch on a specific example in a moment. And Susan, I really appreciated your point about context. And I just had to smile at the discussion of local optimization by middle managers. I've also worked with a lot of firms, and you certainly see that kind of behavior. So we've already discussed sort of some of these economies of scope. I want to zero in mostly on data. And it's kind of widely observed and I think accepted that these large platform firms have access to the best data. That gives them the ability to train their algorithms, machine learning. That helps with horizontal expansion to adjacent markets, vertical integration opportunities. May end up having them compete, sort of directly with their suppliers or people who operate on the platforms. And that's an area of significant concern. One thing I think that we haven't talked about much and is, again, a contextual issue is where do the kind of returns to scale really matter? And you have kind of enormous amounts of data to get decent performance versus where can entrants still collect relatively small data sets and end up still being able to produce reasonable products and services. And I'd kind of like to see a bit more of that in the regulatory discussion. In terms of individuals, so, we've heard this, and I think Christina mentioned, and others, this notion of the EU and GDPR, sort of establishing rights to your data when you interact with these systems. Well, what does that really mean in practice? I can download and distribute data to other firms, but that requires me to operate, more as IT manager, and really requires pretty significant technical skills. And we've seen failures in the past. If you think something like Microsoft's Health Vault, one of the challenges was that they tried to get individuals to be responsible for interacting and collecting data across the different repositories. And they had some interoperability, but there was a lot of friction and transaction cost at the individual level. So where that ends up really kind of biting is, if you think about the nature of data, some of it doesn't change much. So my name doesn't change frequently, my date of birth, hopefully not at all, my address. Other data, of course, is quite rapid, my location, recent purchases, consumption, interaction with different services. So when we talk about sharing data, what does that mean if it depreciates nearly instantaneously, or if it loses context because I don't have the adjacent sort of information from networks? And that's something that I think needs to be resolved. And I don't know that this issue of data portability really gets there. And then if you just take a kind of a right turn and think about some of the firm problems as they work to adopt AI and machine learning, and in particular, think incumbent firms that have grown up as verticals. So a lot of the big tech and cloud platforms that we're used to talking about have these sort of big horizontal data models that are quite easily accessible across the organization. But other firms, think incumbent healthcare firms, manufacturing firms, they're trying to adopt these technologies. And much of the analytics we see is kind of this craft production process. So there's this enormous effort involved in munging and assembling custom data sets. They might want to work with partner firms. Those partner firms, for example, smaller analytics firms, will then ask them to port the data. But the issue there, and much the same way that people who've been involved in kind of computer, any kind of code development, is you have forking. So if you're going to fork the data by sending it out and then munging it and assembling it with other data sets, how in the world are you ever going to have any kind of repeatability or auditability? And say, well, how do I know that this algorithm was working off the source of truth, but this other one, somehow you contaminated it? So that repeatability need at some of these firms is actually likely to dovetail, I think, with some issues around how you might improve competition. And let me try to at least make that case. So one firm in particular that I've worked with is essentially saying to their analytics providers, look, we're not going to send you data anymore. That just doesn't work. We're going to set an environment up and you bring the algorithms here. We've got the tens of millions of users. and we're going to have one source of truth of the data layer, and then you operate and create products and services based on that. That's an interesting example, and I think it has some echoes in PSD2 of allowing fintech startups, for example, to come in and then take payment opportunity or actions on, say, a bank account with consumer behavior. And you could expand that idea and say, well, what if that were compulsory? And with the permission of the end user, i.e. me as a consumer, when I interact with one of these systems, I could grant a third-party firm access to my data, but in real time, in context, and then operating in sort of this infrastructure environment. You could solve a lot of problems with that. You could solve sort of the freshness of data problem. You could solve the contextual problem. Also, we've talked a bit about privacy and security. It would be a lot easier if you were not distributing data every time it was requested, but instead kept it in one place. Christina, I thought you had a great point about the walled garden issue, but if it was compulsory, then you might well be able to solve some of that. But I do agree that that's something to look at. But I think the strength of not having this kind of third and fourth party potential access to leakages of data, but instead you'd be able to audit, okay, well, you had access to this, and we can verify that, could do a lot for improved security. And then, I think Fiona's point about wanting market level versus firm level network effects is a really important one. And this could have a lot of nice kind of features around that. So kind of the final point I'd say is—
we got 20 seconds left.
The final point is we've got 20 seconds left. Take it away, Marshall.
Well, it sounded like you did manage to answer the question. You did have a question from the audience earlier on how PSD2 might be applied to open banking. So I thought, making it compulsory so that others could share and then achieve some interoperability was great. So appreciate your ability to actually get that in as well. Fantastic. Thanks, Jeff. Actually, we can share some of the writings on that particular topic with the audience as well once this is over. With that, I'd like to call in Marco Ianciti, who's the David Sarnoff Professor at Harvard Business School. And he's been an iconic practitioner of platform stuff ever since his book back in 2004 on the Keystone Advantage. Marco's interesting. He's got an AB and PhD in physics from Harvard. So he's been around in this for a while. He's an early advocate of platforms. I use a number of his cases in my classes. Recent work by Marco has been focusing on artificial intelligence, network effects, digital ecosystems. And he's had, one of the top 10 HBO articles 3 times in each of the last 4 years. He's co-founded several companies, has one listed on the NASDAQ, including Keystone Strategy Group. And then he's been an advisor to Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Intel, and has even done expert witness work for the European Commission and the Department of Justice. So with that, Marco, give us your views on platforms and regulation.
Marshall, thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be part of this panel and recognize everyone that's contributed so far, that so many people that I've learned so much from over the years. So it's really fantastic to be here, and thank you for organizing this. A couple of things that I wanted to emphasize, because many of the things have been said, but a couple of things I really wanted to emphasize and maybe summarize a little bit. One point, though, maybe extends the arguments a little bit, which is this year has been obviously an interesting year for many different reasons with the COVID pandemic. And one of the things that we've seen around this year is a dramatic acceleration in digital transformation that has occurred across the economy. And essentially, we're accelerating a phenomenon that's been around for a long time. And one of the points that's really important to understand, especially as we look forward a little bit in thinking about the regulatory innovation that's needed, this is not something that is a function of a few classic digital platform names. This is something that is a function of almost every large organization in the economy. And this is one thing that Marshall, you know very well, because he did some great research on this, showing that many of the existing firms, I think it was around 50%, if I remember correctly, really do behave in many ways like platforms. And it's one of the things that we've seen in so many different industries. One of my favorite examples is a company called Intuitive Surgical. It has a platform in the surgery space. It's been around for a long time, actually 20 or 30 years, to just drive surgical robots. But over the last 5-6 years, it really has expanded its platform strategy. And as a result, it's a dramatic success in the marketplace, literally increasing its market value by something like a factor of 10 to something in the neighborhood of $90 billion. So this is a real platform, and it's got some of the main similarities and differences with many other different organizations. The way that I think about platforms is fundamentally having really 3 different dimensions of value. And value is really important to strategy. Economists might call it more utility, but it's really a function of how they compete, right? And so traditional companies compete by what we call product value or traditional differentiation. Platform compete on 2 additional dimensions, which is network value and data value. Now, the thing that's important to understand is just like in traditional sort of antitrust, where we deal with sort of product value, dealing with unique advantage and potentially monopolistic behavior, or at least some kind of market power, the same thing can happen by having strong network effects or by having a lot of data value. Although in many ways, the field is really complicated. It really depends very, very much from place to place. And we've seen it, for example, with Fiona and Susan talking very much about the impact of multi-home and interoperability on network effects and the ability of a platform to use network effects to gain dominance or to perform different kinds of anti-competitive behavior. But there are many other variables as well. Like, for example, different networks are very different one from the other. Some being very clustered and much easier for a startup to enter by focusing in on one specific cluster. There could be a geographic cluster or a specific group of users, as in a more focused social network, for example, as we've seen something like TikTok that has managed to enter what is a crowded space and what is something that's occupied by some very powerful platforms. Now, one of the things that we're starting to understand, and we're doing a lot of research on this these days, is that the concept of data value is even more complex than the concept of network effects. And data value, as Jeff said very eloquently, really depends a ton on what it is that the data is about and what it is that you use it for. One of the things we talked a lot about is the time dependency of data, which Jeff also emphasized, which is really a huge thing. There are some kinds of data that last forever, some kinds of data that decay very rapidly. And it's very important to understand that and how it impacts competition, how it impacts any kind of potential remedy to competition. Well, that's absolutely instrumental. But there are many other dimensions as well. And it's one of the things that from an economics and business perspective, we can learn a lot actually from the engineering literature around the scalability, for example, of data and its impact on algorithms. And there is a lot of research on that is extremely useful to talk about essentially the limited scalability of many kinds of data sources and data elements and data types and so on. And it really does depend, and it's very important to actually look at this in a lot of depth. And it's not true that data is similar to a network effect or the data drives. It's a fundamentally different set of considerations that shapes how the data really leads to important competitive advantage. I mean, some of the factors that make data different, for example, revolve around the usability, the accuracy, the relevance of the data, of course, how the data scales with volume, and how the data impact and value scales with volume. Is there a very long tail of use cases the data doesn't necessarily easily accustomed for or not? Is the data itself clustered, and is very segmented, where the data you get from one kind of user doesn't necessarily help you in predicting what a different kind of user might do? And Andre Hagi, who's following me, has done a lot of great research on this. Are there complementarities that make the data more valuable? Is it exclusive? Is it not? Is it imitable? Many different data sets are correlated with each other. And so the behavior of one data set and its impact on an algorithm is very similar to another. So from that perspective, it's a really interesting, rich problem. And it doesn't mean that having a lot of data, having strong capabilities in data analytics and AI drives some kind of dominance. And one of the most prominent examples, I think, is Netflix and the premium video market. Where Netflix is an organization that probably has done more than anyone else that I know of in terms of trying to figure out all the different ways that it can use its data to enhance its business, to drive all kinds of different competitive dynamics, to entrench itself as far as it can. And as we've seen in recent years, this is probably one of the most competitive environments around. We've seen entry from new players. We have seen entry from Amazon. We have seen entry from traditional players like Disney, Viacom, everyone. And so it's been an environment that I would say right now is pretty highly competitive, as we've seen, even for price decreases and things like that. And yet one where there's a tremendous amount of data, and it's really relevant to driving value for the users. So from this perspective, I think fundamentally the answer is that it depends, which is a challenge for regulators, but it's also a really interesting thing for researchers, because I think from my perspective, there are a lot of really good and interesting open issues around both the nuances of network effects and their impact of competition across the board. And even more interesting, the nuances of data and algorithm scaling, and the impact of those considerations on competition in various markets.
So we only have a minute left for questions, but do you have any thoughts on how data ownership drives innovation? Because data can be a non-rival asset, as distinct from oil or dollars. Multiple parties could own it. So do you have any thoughts on how data ownership could actually drive innovation in a platform context?
I mean, it's a broad question. I guess the short answer is in many ways, but I'll give you one story, which actually comes from my son. And it's a pretty funny story, because he was working in a tiny little startup that was actually trying to compete with Google on email auto-suggests, okay? And so obviously Gmail has a pretty interesting data advantage over this tiny little startup with 4 kids from MIT. And yet, they scraped data, they found all kinds of public email data sets. They even found the Democratic National Committee exposed data, which they use to calibrate their algorithms. And I think, as this, in many ways where there's a will, there's a way. Having lots of data does not mean having a competitive advantage, and having a creative entrepreneur means you can find additional interesting solutions.
Well, I'm glad to hear. Well, I hope your son's done well, and that'd be interesting to see him listed on NASDAQ along with one of your other companies. See if that works. So with that, thank you very much. Let me see if I can pull Andre Haju into the conversation. Andre is a research scholar and associate professor at Boston University Questrom. He's also been faculty teaching at Harvard Business School and MIT. He has a bachelor's in math and economics from École Polytechnique, also master's science in École de la Statistique. For those of you who know him, you might have some idea that he also speaks Romanian, French, English, Spanish, and some Japanese and Chinese. So if you want international antitrust, he can give it to you in 6 languages, a little bit unusual for most folks. He's widely published in top academic journals. He's also been 3 times in the must-read category and on Thinkers 50 radar on the topic of platforms. And he's also been an angel investor in platforms. So he's actually on the ground making things happen, not just theorizing it. So he's wearing multiple hats, if you will. So Andre, I know you've got some recent work on whether platforms should compete in their own marketplaces. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Marshall. And just to make it clear, I can only speak of platforms and antitrust in one language, and that's English. Don't ask me to speak about it in French or other languages. I can maybe say jokes in the others. Okay, so I think everyone's aware of this. I mean, there's this trend of a lot of platforms, and I think the usual suspects are Amazon, Apple, and Google, who play this dual role of both being a platform, so operating a marketplace, and participating, in their own name with their own products or services in those marketplaces. And this has become a very, I guess, a very popular topic among regulators around the world. So the concern, which I guess at the high level is valid, is that, well, you have these platforms, they're owning they're owning the field and the referees, so to speak. And we should be concerned about a level playing field. And unfortunately, one of the most prominent policy remedies that has been advanced and actually implemented in a couple countries around the world, including India, if I'm not mistaken, has been to actually say, we will forbid, just point like you are not allowed to function as this dual mode. So you got to choose, either you're a pure marketplace or you're a pure retailer or whatever, seller of products. So I'm just going to make a bold claim here, maybe to simulate some conversation. I think this is one of the most misguided policy approaches to platforms. So I'll get to this towards the end of my remarks, but I'll say it up front. I mean, I definitely think there could be a legitimate cause for concern here, but I think it's best addressed through behavioral remedies than through this like very blunt hammer of a structural remedies that says you cannot have the dual mode. So let me be very clear. I mean, I think if you think about it for 2 minutes, I think it should be pretty obvious that outright banning dual modes or marketplace and retailer does not make a lot of sense. So first of all, imagine, if you will, that there's more than one product category. So like imagine there's 10 product categories. It is quite possible that third-party sellers are better at selling or more efficient or higher quality, whatever have you. They're better at selling some of those products. And the platform owner is better at selling the others. Well, obviously, it just makes sense from efficiency from all kinds of point of view to allow the platform to focus on the platforms that they're better at and the third-party sellers to focus on the products that they're better at. So I think it makes little sense to ban this dual modes when you think about across products. So then you can take it, let's take a more charitable interpretation of this policy proposal. So let's think, does it actually make sense to ban it at a product level? So let's say, okay, across product is fine, but what about, let's say there's one product or one product category. Of course, there's the issue of how you define the products and product categories. Should we ban the platform to compete with the third-party sellers within that product category? And again, you can say, well, the platform has the advantage, they can distort competition. Now, even there, though, I would say there's a clear efficiency argument. And the simple argument is, well, the platform participating and competing with its own third-party sellers actually creates competitive pressure and can actually, lead to efficiencies. But, point well taken, it is true that the platform may do some nefarious things. So usually when you push people to articulate what exactly are the concerns, there's typically two types of concerns that you always hear. So first of all, the platform will imitate. So they'll copy, they'll use proprietary data, they'll imitate the innovative product by a third-party seller. So that's one. And the second one is they will use self-preferencing. They'll just play around with their algorithm and recommend their own product instead of maybe the more deserving third-party product. So on the first point, I think it's useful to sort of demystify a little bit these things. So on the first point, the point that platforms are imitating, they're using proprietary data. So in principle, that sounds right, but if you look a little bit more closely, it's actually very hard. I mean, it's useful to ask, like, what exactly is this magical proprietary data that somehow, let's say, Amazon observes that is not observable by anyone else and allow them to copy the product? So you may say, well, Amazon knows exactly what's selling, what products are selling better than others. But in truth, actually, Amazon does publish aggregate measures. So actually, you can go scrape the Amazon data. You can figure out very quickly which products are most successful in any given category. So even there is maybe there's some data advantage, but I think it's not as, it's not like they have this massive data advantage that people imagine. It's very easy for a third party to figure out what products are selling and then just copying them. So the second concern, I think, is the more valid one, and that's the one about self-preferencing. Maybe this is a rejoinder to some of the previous remarks that people have made. So this self-preferencing or playing around with the algorithm, I think underlies a lot of issues. So for example, Marshall, I think you started at the beginning by mentioning the recent antitrust case against Amazon, which is on the face of it is about price parity. But remember, price parity per se is illegal. So Amazon cannot say in their contract, you agree not to sell something at a lower price somewhere else. But what they can do is basically punish third-party sellers for selling the same product at a lower price somewhere else. Now, how they do that? Well, they use the algorithm, right? So it's not like it doesn't say in the contract, but they'll basically demote the product. And of course, the third-party sellers will figure that out. So I think this idea, so this self-preferencing underlies a lot of the concerns. And I think this to me is the only serious actual concern that needs to be addressed here. And again, I still don't think just for that, it's worthwhile to say you can't have a dual mode. I think it's better to think about some sort of behavioral remedy that will address the issue of self-preferencing. So for example, a proposal that I've seen, I didn't come up with this, by the way, so other people have proposed and have fleshed out in a pretty convincing way, I thought was to force, so basically to ask the platforms to have public APIs, which will be accessible to approved outsiders, and which allow these outsiders to audit what the algorithm does. I don't want them to disclose the algorithm to make it open source, but you should allow, so it should be possible for an outsider, say a regulator or researchers, to figure out, okay, in this given product category, how often is this algorithm, does it truly give me like the best product, or does it, does it favor Amazon? So again, I think there's, for all these issues, again, for at least for the one issue which I think is truly relevant, I think there's a behavioral remedy. I don't think it makes sense to go to this like structural remedy.
Great. So we have a minute and a half left. Let me draw, one factual element of support and one polite challenge,
Sure.
and the late question there. Fiona remarks in the panel that most favored nation clauses, actually getting better terms, probably are legal in the United States. So the Amazon hasn't used those as much recently, but they're still actually technically legal. To give your argument a little bit of support, actually,
Marshall,
in India, it's quite
sorry.
interesting. Oh, you want to jump in,
Not
please?
that I give legal advice online, but let me just, you rephrased what I said. What I said was they are not per se illegal in the United States. You have to bring an antitrust case and try to win.
Thank you.
And Andre said that, I thought he said that they were, and I just want the audience not to, that Amazon used to have these contracts, for example.
So I think this is one of the issues that's coming up recently in the suit that is going forward. So thank you for that. It was also interesting, just a bit of data point, and you were correct. It is the Indian legislation that had barred it, and the legislation was actually written such that you can't participate in the marketplace for any app on top or store on top for which you have greater than 25% equity. And the fascinating data that came out that is that within 2 weeks, they had simply sold off their equity above 25% and then engaged in the practices all over again. And I believe that was as fast as 2 weeks. So it was quite interesting that remedy didn't seem to work. So I guess in a few seconds, did you have any thoughts on what would solve the anti-biasing question? How would you publish the criteria for ranking? How would you solve it?
Right. So first of all, yeah, I didn't think it was illegal per se illegal. And by the way, I think this is important because most favored nation clauses, like I alluded to, I think it's extremely difficult to pin. I mean, they're not crazy. Like Amazon's not going to put it in their contract today that says like, you agree not to sell, like they're not stupid, right? So what they're going to do is like very subtle, like it's either going to be subtle or it's going to be implicit, right? So that's why it's very hard to go after. So to me, the solution, I'll repeat what I said. The solution I think is like have a public API, which people like from the outside can audit. Again, I know it's imperfect and we can discuss this more at length, how you would implement this, but I think there's definitely a viable solution. You get outsiders, you allow them to audit what is the algorithm recommending? You have to have enough data for that.
I would like to have those criteria published. Andre, thanks. I think you've also got some great work, which we'd be delighted to share with the audience after this. Let's bring in Daniel Sokol to the conversation. Daniel is a Hubert C. Hearst Chair of Law Professor at University of Florida, although USC has just poached him and he'll be joining them in this fall, both in the business school and the law school. He's also a practicing attorney for White and Case, so he's also a practitioner and as well as academic writer. He has quite a remarkable set of publications on this, all recent. So Oxford Handbook on International Antitrust and Economics, Antitrust, Regulation and Big Data, The Curse of Bigness, Antitrust in the New Gilded Age, Can EU Regulate Platforms Without Stifling Innovation, Rising Risk of Platform Regulation, and I think that's not even the full list. So there are a number of things that Daniel has actually put forward on the best ways to do this. So Daniel, can you recapitulate some of that thinking and summarize it for our audience?
Sure. First, I want to extend a little bit the disclosure. So what it means when I'm practicing with a law firm part-time, I have clients, some of which are industry associations, some of which are companies, some of which are big tech companies. Sometimes I'm also working against big tech companies. But the only thing that I'd also like to disclose is apparently there's only one publication that matters, and that's the one I wrote with Marshall in the loan management review. So broadly, I have some of what, in fact, I've written with Marshall or written with Carmelo, also on, we've identified some basic frameworks. So I want to just take one step back and then dive in. So on the one step back, where are we? We're in a world where I think it's not simply inevitable. We're already there for some kind of regulation everywhere outside the United States. I think that ship has sailed. Do we have the right kind of regulation? That's where the debate is. And I think people have already identified many of those issues. I'll bring up some additional ones to think through. In the United States, it's a little more complicated, in part because we don't have the same kind of historical background, and where we've had regulation, the common concern has been it hasn't really kept up, A, with the technology, or B, with some of the moving pieces, and it's much more scattered. So we have very different regimes, whether finance, healthcare, general data, et cetera. And I think that creates problems because many of the kind of concerns require some amount of coordination, whether or not that means regulation in the United States, still up for grabs. Increasingly, I'm thinking maybe there is a role for certainly for a data coordinator, if not regulator, to deal with these kind of digital issues. And that's something that we haven't really seen in the US debate really push, sort of, what would this actually mean in practice? And so, you know, who's done it better, maybe, and where are we seeing? So on the coordination, I think we see it best in the UK, where a number of these different agencies get together and have some kind of coordination. Within Asia, I actually think it's Japan that's done it the best, mostly, where they have what they call a digital headquarters. Again, they're still working it out. It doesn't include the financial side, doesn't include the health side, but it includes at least telecom, competition, and the trade ministry. So that's one big issue. But there are a few quick little things I'd like to say. One of it goes directly to what Marshall asked. So one of it is proportionality. We should actually have solutions targeted to the problem that has to be solved. So that means identifying the problem. And as we've heard with a number of speakers across different approaches, make sure that we have remedies that work. Otherwise, we lose the value of the digital economy. I think Marco really explained so eloquently, and Jeff, as to the value creation aspect. The second point is something we haven't talked about, which is the issue of inclusion. So we know platforms, particularly in the last year, we've seen platforms have created opportunities for some disadvantaged groups around the world to participate in a more global economy and to have economic opportunities that they may not have had before. And we don't want to crush that by having too onerous a set of platform rules that would basically hurt disadvantaged groups from participating. And indeed, there are a set of trade-offs, both short-term and long-term, price and non-price. We have to acknowledge if we are no longer as concerned about low prices, that hurts the poor. And we just have to acknowledge that's one of the trade-offs. We haven't had that. Instead, for example, we've had sitting FTC commissioners talk about the importance of Black Lives Matter and never once talk about low prices. To me, that's a little weird. And it's just part of the conversation we need to have. Third point I'd say is flexibility, which goes, I think, links with proportionality. Let's not create broad limits, or even, to Andre's point, prohibitions, or maybe in Spanish, Andre, prohibiciones, that are meant for one or two companies, but actually don't apply to all the companies. That's even within GAFA, let alone outside of GAFA, because the DMA certainly applies outside of GAFA. I'd actually say that the DMU in the UK, I think, is a bit more nuanced from what we see at this snapshot in time than the DMA. And it's part of it goes to some other research that we've seen that many distinguished panelists here have talked about limits. We have lock-in, except for when we don't have lock-in, for example. So problems exist in certain industries more than others. And the question is, how do we have some kind of flexible approach that doesn't put us into a position, you know, to Andre's point, prohibitions, or that applies in some companies and not others, and doesn't allow for the kind of experimentation we want to have. So what I would suggest simply is there is a need for regulation. Working through it depends on a number of different factors. A, the particular country. B, the particular set of issues that you're dealing with that may be distinct. I think some of the privacy concerns in the United States look different than here, but here's the twist. GDPR has had a global impact. And there's a lot of extraterritorial reach, whether intended or not, for all kinds of different solutions. And that's more of a legal issue, but it's one, I think, that goes to fundamental business strategy and how we deal with what the strategy literature would call the non-market strategy, which is particularly complex in fast-moving markets. I'll stop there.
So you have a question from the audience on GDPR. How does that affect what's the impact of GDPR, relative to platform value?
So
question from Federico Nuccio.
Okay, so there's a limited amount of empirical work specific to GDPR. Marshall, as you know, one of your junior colleagues in marketing, Garrett Johnson's done really tremendous work in this area. He's not the only one. There's a forthcoming paper that Ginger Jin and some of her co-authors have done with regards to AI spending GDPR and also entrepreneurship clustering in GDPR that suggests that there are problems. Now, in the private chat, Christina had mentioned this is not really identifying everything. That's right, but it turns out this is what we have empirically that's made it through the peer review process. There is some work, believe it or not, in what I would call information systems meets accounting/finance, where GDPR is playing a much larger role in company level disclosures. What does that actually mean in terms of changing either the nature of R&D or the nature of business strategy? We don't know. But there does seem to be some kind of effect if you look at analyst calls and you look at 10K disclosures in the risk section. GDPR is playing a larger role.
Interesting. Wonderful.
Can I correct the description of what I said in the chat? Because I didn't say there's other things. I said that GDPR is a framework that in Europe we have designed. It is better than nothing, which is what's there in other places. I do think that there are, of course, trade-offs everywhere. We need to absolutely, however, concern ourselves with the protection of our data, and that is a priority. There will be some costs attached to that. Do I care if 300 derivative apps, some sleazy games are not made? They drop out of the platform? Don't care. That's the point I'm making. There are trade-offs that are being made, and we cannot say, we cannot deter any single app from doing any single thing because that's deterring innovation. I put that on a different level than concerning ourselves with what is done with our data. And that is what Europe is trying to do. Not very well, there are drawbacks, but don't use the talking points of big tech to push back on GDPR, because this is what I'm hearing.
Again, thank you for confirming the colorful character, Christina. I appreciate that. Actually, I'll have a couple of comments on GDPR. I actually think there's some interesting elements about innovation and how data portability might be superseded by in situ data rights. I think there may be some interesting ways to actually get the best of both in that. I do want to make sure that we have time for our final speaker. We were originally going to have David Teese, and as a late replacement, we have his co-author, Henry Coati. Henry's actually got his PhD from UPenn, and he probably more than any of us began his career as an economist for the antitrust division of the DOJ, so perhaps might even have the longest view of these issues of anyone. He's been managing mergers and acquisitions for the government and private litigation for the Department of Justice, Federal Trade Commission, Canadian and Irish Competition Tribunals, Directorate General for European Competition, and others. His work considers price fixing, antitrust damages, class certification. And one of his most recent works, together with David Teese, has been the question of, is the Digital Markets Act the cure for Europe's ills, platform ills? So it'll be an interesting piece of work that might be able to share. So Henry, what's your thoughts on this issue of dynamic innovation and whether or not the regulation is warranted?
Sure. So I'm going to make a couple of comments, and I'm happy to provide the article that we wrote about the DMA. So I'd like to actually kind of share a couple comments about that, and also wrap up a couple of the different themes that we heard on today's discussion, and in some sense bring this back to some antitrust first principles. or some competition economics first principles. So my first principle that I want to get back to is a discussion about what is the source of the market power or the monopoly power or the monopoly profits or whatever it is that we're targeting with the regulation. What is the source of that? Market power derived from practices that inhibits entry is very different than market power that is derived from innovative activity. And we don't want to, or we want to, I think, let me phrase it this way, we want to be careful about actions that inhibit innovative activity, precisely because we know that the social returns to innovative activity are so much greater than the private returns. So we'd like to avoid, to the extent that we can, harm to the broader economy derived from adverse impacts on innovation. We started, actually at the very start of Christina's talk today, she said that there are concerns about market power and exercising that market power against businesses, right? That framework, there's market power. No kind of discussion really today about the extent to which the problems that we're addressing, generally speaking, with broad-based regulations are targeting monopolistic practices, the creation of barriers to entry, or innovative activity. And we need to be able to distinguish among them in any instruments that we develop on the regulatory side. Second point I want to stress is that I don't think we have enough nuance in the competition economics, in the antitrust analysis that we do to deal with the digital economy. A lot of what we do and a lot of the frameworks that we apply are derived from the standard industrial economy that we've been familiar with for the last 100 years, right? We define markets by looking at close substitutes. We look at cross elasticities of demand between products. We look at diversion between products. And a lot of that is not really the way to think about competition in the digital economy. In the digital economy, we see things like competition for the market, as opposed to competition of multiple Facebook lookalikes trying to compete with each other. You see broad spectrum competition. The comments from Susan before about Amazon, taking some of the assets that it has and combining with other assets to develop something new and enter areas and grow. We see different types of competition here. And if you go and you look at the DMA and read the impact assessment for the DMA, it actually talks about trying to redirect competition from being competition for the market to being competition in a market. Like we fundamentally want to change the nature of competition. That strikes me as a dangerous game to play. The competition is what it is. The nature of competition is what it is. And we need to be very, very careful with that. That's not to say that there are things that we should not do, but I think we need to be very, very kind of careful with that. And another kind of comment along those lines, think about the Facebook investigations at the Federal Trade Commission or the Facebook case here. I think a lot of that, and I didn't work on those matters, right? So I'm not disclosing anything here that's confidential. I didn't work on those matters. But I think a way to think about the trajectory of the time path of that whole series of investigations and the litigation is that the FTC looked at this. They looked at a couple of matters with a standard lens of competition economics, looking for close substitutes, looking for established competitors and cross elasticities, didn't see them, move on. Only later do we realize that what really matters is competition for the market, which some of the acquisitions that they've made, could impact. And so it's a theory of potential competition, and what that theory of potential competition looks like in the digital economy that is quite important, and that I don't think we have a very good handle on right now to kind of advise policymakers on. Last comment I'd like to make at a high level is, and there was some language today about ecosystems, I think it actually helps to drop the eco from the ecosystem for at least a short time. Because when you just think about these as systems, some things naturally flow from that. And the one that I think is most important is that when you impact a system at one point, it can have adverse effects on the system elsewhere. Maybe not even adverse effects, just effects, right? taking action on, say, an app store is going to have implications elsewhere for the ecosystem or the system. It's going to have a whole range of potential other impacts that you need to worry about, and probably in a lot of cases, unintended consequences that we need to think through carefully. I think it makes sense to kind of wrap up. A lot of the discussion we've had today is very general. I'd actually like to offer for everyone to think about two articles or two parts of the DMA in Europe. Article 5 deals with obligations for gatekeepers, and I'd like to just read to you item C. Item C deals with the obligations for platforms allowing customers to contract off platform. Article C, item C in Article 5 reads, allow business users to promote offers to end users acquired via the core platform service and to conclude contracts. So promote offers and conclude contracts with these end users, regardless of whether for that purpose they use the core platform. That is to say, the platform can match up buyers and sellers, but when it comes time to contract, you can go off platform. That is at a very basic level, free riding. And what we teach in Econ 101 is that free riding is something that we should try to avoid because it has perverse incentive effects. The DMA directly invites free riding, and that has important ramifications. Go back to what I was just saying about unintended consequences. What is the business model if you're, say, a travel site and people are currently concluding transactions on your site? And you can't do that post DMA because people can go off platform. You probably have a different business model. It's probably a business model where you charge an annual fee to a subscription fee. But a subscription fee model as opposed to a zero price for consumers is very different. It's going to have implications for the penetration of the platforms, the types of transactions that occur on the platforms and the use of them. And I'd just like to throw out one more, which is Article 6, item J, and this relates to search engines. A dominant search engine, so think Google search, should provide to any third-party providers of online search engines upon their request with access on fair, reasonable, and non-discriminating terms, so FRAN terms, ranking, query, click, and view data in relation to both free and paid search generated by end users on the online search engine. So ranking, query, click, and view data. That is the guts of the intellectual property that you have if you are Google. We're going to provide that on FRAN terms to rivals. That's not quite the same free riding in the first example that I gave you, because there's at least a payment for it. It's a FRAN fee, a FRAN payment, but it's certainly a different payment than they have now. So it's not quite free riding, but it's close. And that has implications for the evolution of the search engine. It's going to have implications for innovation, for investment in the products. And I don't think that we've actually given a lot of detailed thought about the nuts and bolts, but how the provisions fit together and what the implications of them actually are. So, I encourage people to actually look at the details of some of these things and to think through just basic economics about how are these things going to relate to each other? How do they play out? What are the changes in the business models that you're going to see? What are the market impacts of some of these? Take a step back from the high level and actually let's look at some of the details. And then I'll stop.
Yeah, no, I think we're at time, so I really need to draw the line for the benefit of our audience. Let me just offer a few thoughts and one or two concluding remarks. One thing I do want to mention in some of Henry's work and David Teese's work is really interesting. The dynamic innovation aspect really is important. It was a wonderful observation, some of the most recent writing that was news to me, that Apple watches now outsell all the entire Swiss watch industry combined, which is really interesting. So you add up Tissot and Tag Heuer and Swatch and others, Apple has come from a completely different angle. And we want to embrace that kind of innovation. It's really quite interesting. So I'd like to summarize just a few quick thoughts for the audience. Again, the real question was, should we regulate platforms, and if so, how? I would personally answer that first question, obviously in the affirmative, speaking as information economics. If we think of the presence of market power, of information asymmetries, of public goods, of externalities, those are all occasions when we experience market failures, which in some sense induce the need for governance of one form or another. This then raises the question of whether or not we can use traditional antitrust rules to address these issues. Could we treat platforms as infrastructure? I suspect from many of the conversations that we've heard today, particularly on data and network effects, the answer to that is no. The reason is we'd have to treat it as infrastructure plus network effects. That means there are externalities present. Externalities require a governance model to deal with them. And some of the work that I did with Jeff Parker actually suggests that governance, in this case, will do a better job than either markets or hierarchies. So that we want to actually allow the creation of network effects and allow some of the creation of value. But that's not to say that the problem then is that self-interested governance is still below the social optimum. So we don't necessarily get the social optimum. So I would like to re-ask the final question, which is, I think too frequently the antitrust authorities are trying to create privacy and trying to create competition, when in fact, I think the question they should be asking is, if we're going to design the right legislation, we need to be creating value. And so I really think we need to figure out the first step is how the design mechanisms creates value, and then we get to the question of how we divide that value. So those are in some sense, I think, summary thoughts on what I think is a really wonderful set of issues. I want to thank our set of panelists. We have a remarkable set of diversity. I leave it to the audience to whom you think was a progressive or operative or a intermediate in between. We will have recorded this and we'll send out news of the various links to the research reports provided by the various speakers. And we invite you to interact with us both at the subsequent Platform Research Summit and Platform Executive Summit coming up in July. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll look forward to seeing you online again in the future. Thank you.